Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to ENTC 4777 or ENTC 5777 Safety Management. This course will be held online and for the most part will be self-paced as long as we don't encounter difficulties such as D2L blowing up or not being able to meet assignment deadlines. If you take a look at your syllabus, you'll notice this course is focused on planning, organizing, and control of a corporate safety program. We will cover problems with safety within industry, causes of accidents, safety training and leadership, and we will focus on the motivation and marketing methods to promote safety within the organization. We will also cover the practices and procedures required by the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, as well as the Tennessee Occupational Safety and Health Administration, commonly referred to as TIOSH. We will be using D2L throughout this course, and each student must be enrolled to have access to the class website. This is necessary as due dates as well as feedback and grading are communicated through D2L. Additionally, all lectures and PowerPoint presentations, as well as assignment guidelines, are stored on the class website. Most of the PowerPoint files include my lecture script, which can be printed out by selecting note pages within the PowerPoint print window. You may still find a few pages failed to transcribe correctly, so please contact me if you have any questions. If you encounter a mention of a due date occurring from a previous semester, just ignore it and follow the date from the course website. It's very likely you may be looking at a presentation from a previous semester I felt still is in pretty good shape. If for any reason you are unable to meet the assignment deadlines, please contact me as soon as possible so we can discuss how you can make up the assignment. An assignment turned in 1 day late will receive a penalty of 10%. All assignments submitted 2 days late will be docked 25%. No assignments will be accepted after 2 days following the due date without a legitimate excuse. The major topics covered in this course will include the historical background of industrial safety, the role of safety and health professionals, safety hazards within the industrial workspace, safety responsibilities to include corporate, employer, individual, and even the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. And finally, we'll look at safety and health programs. Assignments will require Microsoft Office Suite, which is available through ETSU, focusing primarily on Microsoft Word and PowerPoint. Communication for the course must be sent through the ETSU email address. It is important that you use the ETSU account, as any non-ETSU email may be filtered as spam and thus not receive a response. Please include the course number in your subject line. As this course will be conducted online, and many may find it necessary to use Zoom to conduct office hours. Additionally, depending on class performance, it may be necessary to conduct a weekly live session. In the event these sessions are implemented, attendance will be taken and will reflect in your final grade. There will be quizzes assigned for every chapter, although a few quizzes will include 2 chapters. Quizzes will determine 30% of your grade and are also triggers to unlock assignments or exams, such as the midterm exam assignment required to access the midterm exam. This ensures you have been exposed to the material prior to needing it for the assignment or encountering it on the exam. The first 5 chapters will allow 2 attempts at the quiz. Following chapters will be 1 shot. As the quizzes are modified each semester, feel free to challenge any question you believe was incorrectly presented or scored. There are 4 assignments which may be in the format of responding to a questionnaire or submitting reports. The reports will follow the American Psychological Association, or APA's, Writing Style Guide, 7th edition. You are allowed to use ETSU's Communication Lab to review your reports prior to submission. Another resource is the Purdue Online Writing Lab. The course project will be a safety presentation worth 20% of your grade. This will include a presentation video using PowerPoint and a written report to support the presentation. If you are currently employed within a company, I will allow you to use the writing style guide, provided I am given a copy. Otherwise, the report will be in APA Style Guide 7th edition. I do use Turnitin software to detect plagiarism. I find most of the time students do not intentionally plagiarize, but we're not aware of how to properly cite their resources, especially within the body of the document. It's a good idea to use plagiarism detection software prior to submitting reports to ensure you have properly credited each source. If you have any concerns or questions, please feel free to contact me via email, and if necessary, we can set up an appointment to address your concerns. So let's get started with the course. The text for this course is Occupational Safety and Health for Technologists, Engineers, and Managers by David Goetsch. These are the ISBNs, and the text is available in the bookstore. The 9th edition was published in 2019 and contains around 40 more pages than the 8th edition. I found the ebook available online for around $25. A new hardcover is going to set you back about $170, but you may be able to find a used copy online about $60 less. I have not yet evaluated the international edition. However, typically they follow the US version. As far as the book is concerned, it's a very good author. He's got some good content in here. However, it's not well arranged for our purposes, so you will see us jump around a little bit among the chapters as I get them in the order that I prefer. I'd like to introduce all the safety elements prior to getting into how we manage it. And you will notice that on the syllabus as well as the class website.
So what will we be covering? First of all, we will do the safety and health movement during this lecture. The next one will be accidents and their effects. We'll go into health and safety roles, followed by global competition and how health and safety impacts that. We'll look at the Occupational Safety and Health Act, the standards and liabilities your company will face. And we'll look at the ergonomic hazards such as musculoskeletal disorders, MSDs, and cumulative trauma disorders, CTDs. Safety and stress will also be covered. Violence in the workplace becoming more common, unfortunately. We'll look at emergencies, how to respond to those, industrial hygiene in confined spaces, as well as computer automation and robotics. People are really frightened of robots. However, there have not been that many casualties while working with this automation. Mechanical hazards and lockout tagout system will be covered next, followed by falls, impacts, lifting, vision hazards, and personal protective equipment. We'll cover the temperature extremes and burns, also electricity and how burns will be related to that. Fire hazards and life safety. Life safety means protecting the lives of people in buildings and structures, vehicles, and vessels from fire. We'll look at pressure hazards, different areas that you may be concerned with that, and radiation hazards. If you work in medical or in a power plant, then you may be concerned about it. However, radiation hazard also is just working on a construction site in the sun, what damage it can do to the worker's skin. We'll look at noise and vibration hazards, followed by doing a hazard analysis. Next, we'll go into accident and incident reporting, and you can see already that these are jumping around quite a bit. I moved Chapter 8 to this point because I believe that you need to understand the threat before you can actually do a proper investigation. Safety and health training As most of you know, if you've been in business at all, training is one of the first things to get cut when we do the budget. This area is one we need to make sure it does not get cut. We'll look at promoting safety, getting the whole management culture to understand that safety is a necessity, and total safety management. Total safety management came out of total quality management, and environmental management systems, and ISO 14,000. Most of you are more familiar with the ISO 9,000. This grew from that original area. So starting out, we'll look at the developments before the Industrial Revolution. This saying by Confucius, don't expect me to say that. It's study the past if you wish to define the future. This is very similar to the old saw that says, those who do not study the past are doomed to repeat it. Understanding the past can help in administering safety and health. If you look at what occurred in the past, you will understand better what threats exist in the present and how to fix those so that you will have a better sense of what your future should be. Early in industrial, well, this should be industrial revolution, but early in civilization, some of the first laws that came out was the Code of Hammurabi. Complete written legal codes proclaimed by the Babylonian king Hammurabi. So we're looking about 2000 BC in the Mesopotamian region. The code consisted of 282 laws, basically dealt with wages, contracts, and how people should react to offenses in a civilized society. For example, the first law of retribution, the one most people understand today, eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, came from this code. Penalties were weighed also, though, on social status and gender as well. A free man was more valuable, had more rights in the code than a slave. Men's rights were superseded those of women. We look at it as antiquated, but this is what they put down for then. They set fees for physicians and penalties for people who were injured. Penalties for malpractice followed the same scheme. If a doctor had killed a rich patient, the doctor would have their hands cut off. While if he killed a slave, then the only injury suffered then would be paying for the slave. One particular code came about in the earliest construction phases. Code 229 stated if a builder builds a house for someone and does not construct it properly, the house which he builds falls in and kills its owner, then the builder shall be put to death. That sounds pretty harsh, but it gets a little worse. For example, in Code 230, the law states that if the building collapses on the owner's son, killing him, then the builder's son would be put to death. Continuing in Code 233 said if a building under construction has deficiencies and topples, it is the builder's responsibility to pay for and rectify. So let's jump ahead a few hundred years, and we're moving to, let me get my stuff working here. Okay. Let's move into the Egyptian civilization. This was the first time we started to see workers have rights. Workers were allowed 8 hours a day for 10 days, followed by 2 days off. They also enjoyed the first medical services provided by industry. All the workers weren't slaves, but even the slaves were provided medical services. Workers were required to bathe daily. The reason for this is the region was notorious for parasites, particularly during that time. So a lot of lice. The reason you saw a lot of the Egyptian depictions of having shaved heads, wearing wigs, If you have long hair, lice was not the thing that you wanted to deal with, so they shaved their heads and bathed regularly. This was also one of the first times workers went on strike following the death of Ramses II. Their their strike was due to the government was not feeding them or providing wages. So didn't just want to raise and pay; they had a legitimate concern. Continuing forward, we have the Romans, best known for their constructions of aqueducts, sewers systems, public baths, latrines, and well-ventilated houses. The main industries in Rome were the things that we still see today: pottery, brick making, uh, very tied into textiles. Produced the first simple machine was the two-armed loom for weaving textiles, and grain mills for making flour. All courses in architecture are taught on the construction of the Roman Empire. Roman Empire, and we won't dwell on that. Now we'll just continue to move into the AD era. In the 1500s, one of the first texts came out talking about minor sickness and other diseases by Philibus Areolus. Excuse me for the pronunciation. I do get a little tongue-tied on some of these names. Was the first time we had a formal, systematic thesis on pulmonary and the diseases of miners. Covered diseases from smelter workers and metallurgists, particularly on the handling of mercury. Also during that period, we have Georgius Ergola emphasized the needs for ventilation in mines. This is one of his drawings right over to the right. It illustrated the necessity to bring fresh air into the mines. So he identified the problem, designed a machine to actually ventilate it, as well as other machines which would pump water out of the mines to prevent flooding. In the 1700s, another text came out on the discourse of diseases of the worker. This one made a conclusive parallel between diseases suffered by the workers and their occupations. Following that, around the late 1600s, 1700s, we started to see the Industrial Revolution really take off. The main part of the Industrial Revolution was substituting human power with not animal power, they'd used that before, but they took human and animal power and then produced inanimate machines, which would use steam power, water power, as we saw on the wheel before, to replace the people and animal power. When you replace a biological power, which is susceptible to exhaustion, with a source that's capable of running continuously, as long as it's fueled, you start to introduce problems that we hadn't seen before. It also produced another method of converting raw materials, things that humans couldn't do just by hammering away on an anvil. These machines were able to do different ways of molding, casting, and so forth. So we can start to convert our metals. We looked at converting our cotton to textiles in usable forms very rapidly. And we even had farming implements produced. So instead of using a mule, your horse, oxen, whatever, to drag the plow, the first tractors started to come out. And along with those tractors, we needed to build implements to bring behind them. Workers became more and more specialized during this period. And in doing so, you divided labor to the point where people didn't see the end result of what they were building. And that did have an effect. Since the machines did not have limitations on how long they could work, this started to affect the people that were servicing them. If you were an individual at the its whole job was to take the cog off of the conveyor belt and put it in a box neatly instead of just having the belt dump it into a box, that would mean you have to keep up with the machine. The machine would run fast, and management just wanted more production, so they kept them running as fast as they could. You would also be working 12-hour to 16-hour days just doing something like moving cogs around. Or in the case we'll get to in a minute, taking bobbins off, pulling the bobbin spindles off, putting them back into the machine. So something you didn't see the end work does have a psychological effect. Also, the workers became so fixed in doing the work that they did not pay attention to what was going on around them. Add to that proper safeguards were not put around belts, gears, allowing people to fall into those. You started to have a lot of things come out because machines were actually damaging people. When you replace the people with the machines, as I already said, you're going to have entanglement. Workers were exposed to a lot of injuries, death due to the fact there were no guards, no fences keeping you from the machines. Accidents were just a fact of life. The factories were dark, dirty, dusty. The air was polluted, so you would be breathing that in. No respirators provided. Iron workers would work at temperatures up to 130 degrees. Actually, they would exceed 130 degrees many times in the smelting areas. The industrial work was extremely stressful. Work typically is 12 to 16 hours a day. No breaks either, except for lunch. Usually you get 30 to 60 minutes for lunch. No holidays, no paid vacations. All you did was work. Unlike the agriculture labor that we had before, in the factories, everything is fast-paced, focused on production. They even got to the point talking was not allowed between workers as they're doing their job. If a worker came from the farm area, has a family farm, during the harvest, workers were not allowed to go back and help their families out to pull the harvest in. They had to remain at the factory to continue to build the cogs, produce the cloth, whatever they were doing at the time. If a worker was injured on the job, they would be abandoned. They were easy to replace. The tasks were simple. Most of the time, somebody gets their fingers cut off, lose an arm, something to that effect. If you survived it, there was no pay or compensation provided. Sometimes they wouldn't even offer medical treatment. That may not have been covered. Something the Egyptians were doing thousands of years before. They just started to ignore this because it wasn't profitable. The worst thing that happened during this time was the employment of women and children. Now, employing women is not a bad thing necessarily unless you pay them half the rate of what the men were being paid. Same with children. Same number of hours, same type of work, half of the pay. And children started being introduced into the factories as young as 5 years old. And as I mentioned, these were polluted environments. They also did not have a lot of windows because glass cost money. So you didn't get a lot of light coming in here. And it has a lot of effect on the growing body. Children started to experience rickets, other deformity, bone deformities. They would, if they lost a limb, the rest of their life they have to deal with that because not only that, they lose their job as well. Children being smaller also worked very well for them when they revolutionized the mine. They still needed somebody to pull the carts down the rails to back up. Well, if you had a small body, you could get them into a very small area, and you didn't have to build as big of a tunnel. So these children would start to develop things like asthma. Cardiovascular diseases were very popular, or I shouldn't say popular, prevalent. Young girls who had worked in the mines dragging the carts would later die during childbirth due to deformation of their pelvic bones. They could not properly deliver children. And most of the time, they weren't even provided light unless their families could afford to buy them a candle for them to see during the dark. So it would be go down the tunnel in the dark, pull things back up in the dark. The unfortunate thing about this is the poor families that could not afford even the candle, for generations, these children would remain uneducated, perpetuating the poverty, and I'll get into that in a moment. But this particular photo right here from the Library of Congress is showing a couple of small boys working, replacing bobbin spindles inside this cotton gin. And you'll notice on the right, the belt is not covered. A lot of people will be caught into this type of machinery. If you slip, you could fall into the machines because these machines continue to run while you were doing the work. One of the things that come from this era, society started to really be disgusted by how children were being paid. Children did not have the experience. If they fell asleep on the job, they would be beaten for falling asleep on the job. In the event they fell into something and lost them, it was blamed on the children not being aware of what was going on, so their own negligence contributed. Most of the time, and just as 3 times as many industrial accidents occurred to children working in the factories as it did to adults. The children were not given education, so ignorance was perpetuated. The owners of the factory were greedy, and then the families, out of necessity, had to put their children to work just to survive. And this is the perpetuation. If they're not given an education, then you start to see children having a very short period of time for schooling, if at all, that would keep them from improving their condition. Uneducated people were not able to really advance the society. Then you stick them into a factory, something happens, they're disabled, and they're part of, they need to be cared for the rest of their life. In the event a father is healthy, comes out of the factory, he's a worker, circumstances when he does have children say, well, we need to make money, let's put the children to work. The children then return to the factory, and the cycle just begins. Is repeated, I should say. So how did we fix this? To begin with, the first safety and health movements in the modern era during the Industrial Revolution began in England due to an outbreak of typhus among the children in the cotton mills. Manchester, England, 1784, they noticed this. Doctors investigated, found the mills had inadequate ventilation and limited natural lighting. Heating stoves did not provide adequate airflow, not enough heat. Workrooms and their privies, outhouses, most of the time were not cleaned daily, so you had things starting to build up in there. And even the oil that was lubricating the machinery had turned rancid, presenting a health hazard. And I let this slide get ahead of me. This led, very slowly actually, but it led to the 1802 Health and Morals Act of Apprentices. Many of these apprentices that go in to learn the job paid very little, but they also tended to live on site. Since they lived on site, the act said that the owners of these companies needed to take care of the apprentices and provide the proper care for them. Any mill employing more than 3 apprentices had to provide clothing and hygienic equipment. Particularly on the clothing, they had to issue 2 sets of clothing, linens, provide hats, gloves. Boys and girls needed to be housed separately. That hadn't been done before. And also no more than 2 children per bed. So instead of just putting a mattress out there and just tossing everybody into it, you only put 2 of them in a bed. And the children were directed to bathe occasionally. This hadn't been happening before, so you can imagine how that was really building up diseases in the area. This also moved into factories needing to be cleaned at least 2 times a year with quicksilver, excuse me, 2 times a year with quicklime and water. The buildings had to have sufficient windows and ventilation, needed vitamin D, and work was limited. No longer could labor exceed 12 hours a day, excluding the breaks, and there was no night work for children from 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. Allow them to get better rest. Education was required for the first 4 years that they worked at the factory, not from the time they were born, but the first 4 years that they came in the factory, education had to be provided so they get the basics. Uh, Focused mainly on reading, writing, and arithmetic during those years. They also had religious education brought up during that time. So daily education, but they did not specify how many number of hours you had to educate these children. Most of the factories that did apply actually follow this law were pretty good about getting them at the time they were off work. Uh, but if you don't mandate the hours of education, sometimes it will not be conducted. The enforcement was under the local magistrate. If you look at corruption, then a lot of times this did not happen. This led to the law stating that 2 inspectors were to be appointed. Neither one were allowed to be associated with a mill. So you'd have a clergyman and 1 justice of the peace were required. Even this was not well enforced. So you had a lot of these factories still getting away with doing much of what they did before. In the 1800s, Anthracoccus, blacksmith, came around, or was identified, I should say. It'd been there forever. And even though in the early 1800s they identified it, it wasn't really taken good care of until 1875 with the coal miners. By 1930, we've seen things start to happen again. A resurgence of the lung issues, pneumonia coccinus, CWP, was identified due to coal dust inhalation. They also found mercury poisoning was pretty bad in Minamata, Japan, due to chemicals or just dumping methyl mercury into the bay. In doing so, it was polluting the fish in the bay. The people around the area, a lot of fishing, would get the fish, eat the fish, then they would be ingesting that methyl mercury in as well. Silicosis, this we'll talk about a little bit later, as how the Hawksnest tragedy really identified this, but this was inhaling of silica dust particles, causing all kinds of problems. Well, not with breathing, but infections and so forth. Mercury poisoning. If you've ever heard the saying "mad as a hatter," this is what it came from. The hatters would use mercury nitrate to make the felt hats. In doing so, that would be absorbed into their skin, and this had serious effects on the brain. Cognitive abilities just basically disappeared. In 1940, New York City said, okay, we're going to fix this. They replaced the mercury nitrate with hydrogen peroxide, and we started to see this go down. This was kind of pushed off to the side. Coming a little bit closer to our era, in the 1970s, asbestos was identified in a number of problems due to cancer, inhalation. Of course, it's going to affect the lungs, but just swallowing this, getting in your gastrointestinal tract. Anything that was in the air when you're eating your lunch is also going to be transferred to your meal, and again, you ingest it. So you have a lot of problems, both in the lungs and digestive system, and eventually gets to the kidneys, the bile ducts. This started to be a big problem, and continues to be have people recovering. A lot of people retiring now had these areas that they had to work in, and it took a little while for some of it to appear. In the 1980s, the bloodborne pathogens such as AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, hepatitis B came out or was identified, and among healthcare professionals particularly, the people that were exposed to this, a lot of bad things came along, and particularly with the AIDS, people were being fired. Protections had to come in to keep that from happening. A lot of myths came around about how easy it was to contact it, and until those myths were actually overrun, nothing really worked for them. It actually took adding a section to the 1973 Rehabilitation Act. Section 503 stated that managers must make accommodations for these employees suffering from hepatitis B or AIDS, and for anybody that was otherwise qualified for the position. So if you were doing this, you couldn't just automatically be fired. They had to consider the employees' rights during testing and education. Uh, employ and engage in testing and education for all employees to ensure that people are aware of what AIDS and hepatitis B, overcome those myths and misconceptions. As I said, it still exists today. You're seeing a lot of these come up. When I was young, you didn't see lawyers advertise on TV. That just wasn't a normal thing. So advertising for lawyers, if you wanted to advertise, you looked in the phone book and found out if you needed a lawyer. Well, they're on TV a lot now. And mesothelioma has been identified for a while. A lot of it due to asbestos. People are seeking legal aid for this. Now, this is not, I'm not trying to say, these guys are all ambulance chasers. They're trying to resolve something that happened to somebody. So each company needs to take steps to prevent being involved in these cases. Don't use the materials, as well as probably pick up insurance so you can fight against one of these cases, or at least get a proper settlement out of this case. Let's back up a little bit and see how this really got into safety and health movement. What did the government do with it? So in 1867, Massachusetts introduced the factory inspections to enforce the health and morals of Apprentice Act they had adopted from England. I'm a little bit behind. Sorry about that. This was post-Civil War, so 1867 and 1868. This was the first time we started to see barriers actually come in to protect the workers. The first patent for a guard was put down in 1868, and this particular one was by Henry Carse, and he developed this screen guard. All it did was just, when you would be capping these bottles, glass bottles, you're putting a cork cap in them, and if you were using aerated water, basically, fizz and everything would get in there. The gases would go under pressure. You shove the cap down, and then the bottle may break due to crack in it or something like that. Well, as these things would explode, you'd have all these shrapnel, glass shards flying all over the place. And Mr. Carr said, well, when we bring this down to do a cap, let's put this guard over it so it's around the bottle to prevent all those pieces from flying out. First patent, and it took them until 1868 to actually put the guards in. It prevented injury to the operator. More of the people picked up on this, putting more guards out. Okay, we don't need to actually get into these gears. Let's put a guard around these gears so people aren't falling into them. Put a guard around the belt so people don't get entangled in that. During that time, also the Pennsylvania first mine safety law came out, and it required to have 2 exits from a mine. Now imagine before there was only one way in and one way out of a mine, because digging tunnels was a lot of labor. So if something happened and that entry or exit was collapsed, people were trapped in the mines. So this said that you need to have another way for them to get out. So not just the one way in and one way out. We had other laws come up. In 1877, the employee liability law said that employers to be accountable for safeguards for their individual workers. This included personal protective equipment for anyone operating hazardous machinery. And this was came about because of the flywheel explosion. Now, if you look back here, 1877, they had these laws put in, but in 1891, a flywheel exploded from a steam engine and it tore through the building it was in and into a adjoining building. This resulted in 3 people dying. 2 of them were young women that were basically doing all the paperwork in the adjoining building. The third person was the individual who went down to inspect this well before it exploded. Dozens were injured due to the blast of steam debris. This is not something you would normally be able to walk away from if you were around the area. They investigated this, and the following year in 1892, they established the first safety program in Joliet, New York, to prevent against this and say, okay, we need to take these precautions. You started to see preventive maintenance really come out to make sure that something that was cracked did not necessarily become a threat as it exploded. Moving back to the area on the silica, I mentioned before, this was the Hawk's Nest tragedy. Occurred when Union Carbide contractors Reinhardt and Dennis were drilling a passage through the Gosley Mountain in West Virginia, Hawk's Nest region. Resulted in the formation of the Air Hygiene Foundation, but this was really a bad indication, just pretty much evil people driven by greed during this time. The workers were spending 10 hours a day breathing in the silica dust that they were drilling through. They were not given any kind of respirators, no masks, no breathing equipment. They just work in there and then come back out. And when the workers would die, their families would be told that they left to find another job, and the company would say, we don't know where they went. They were actually burying these people in mass graves next to where they were doing the drilling. That's what's discovered later. Silicosis can kill you pretty quickly if you ingest enough of it, because you just can't breathe well enough. But it can take from 10 to 30 years to appear. So you started to see that as well. Hundreds have died from the silicosis ingestion. Many of them, like I said, buried right next to the work site in mass graves. Families just were told that they'd moved on somewhere else. So obviously no compensation was paid for any of this. A fictional report from this is it started to leak out in 1941. Hawk's Nest by Herbert Skidmore really got the public to focus on what was happening. So this has been covered up for over a decade. And that's when we saw the Air Hygiene Foundation formed and take the dusty environments, not only in mines, but in other factories as well. Department of Leadership took this over and said that you had to have some type of compensation for silicosis disease. It's still a problem today. This still exists. It affects about 1 million workers and 250 deaths per year. Not necessarily to the degree that was at that time, but also due to the fact the workers may not be properly wearing their respirators, or they may just lift them up and take them off completely. The Farmington mine disaster in West Virginia was a coal mine explosion. What happened was there was a gas in there. There were improper ventilation, which we saw people trying to take care of all the way back in the 1700s. And so improper ventilation in the mine, gases had built up, and a spark ignited, causing the mine to explode. So this was 1968. The next year, Congress passed the Federal Coal Mine Health and Safety Act. It increased the number of federal inspections we're going to have, fines for safety violations, criminal penalties for anybody that did what had happened in Hawk's Nest, and amended in 1977 and 1978 to broaden the scope of coverage, or I should say amended in 1977 and 1978. Other disasters in 1975, Hopewell, Virginia, Life Science plant was shut down because they had been dumping ketone into the James River. Anybody that's been into this area in Virginia knows this is it was a very pristine area. A lot of fishing, both commercial, tons of recreational fishing. But when they discovered this ketone in the water, the fish, even now, from 1970, are still being found to be contaminated with it. Yes, it is open to recreational fishing now, but it really did damage the business. At that time, they closed hundreds of miles of the waterway down from where this had happened due to the high levels. Next, we move into the Love Canal in Niagara Falls. Some of you may have heard about this in your history classes, but the housing community had been exposed to toxic chemicals. Extremely high levels of benzene were being leaked from corroded drums. The neighborhood had a very high percentage of miscarriages and birth defects and leukemia. Hudson Falls and Fort Edwards in New York. Uh, this was due to the manufacture of capacitors. Those of you working in electronics know how important capacitors are. But GE had been dumping into runoffs to the Hudson River since 1947. So from 1947 to 1974, 3 decades, they've been dumping these PCBs into the Hudson River. The Hudson River was bad enough without them doing that, but the PCBs were being ingested by the fish, and those toxins have been associated with neurological and developmental defects. We have to be concerned about this one because it's still coming on. 1979 is really not that long ago. And the big one that came up with a lot of environmentalists was the Valley of the Drums at West Point, Kentucky. This was a toxic waste site dump. Had been collecting waste since 1960s. They had 100,000 drums inside this area, and drums of waste deposited on the site. Of those, 27,000 were buried. The remainder were above site, so they were just put in pits, open trenches, and just said, "Yeah, this is the way we'll store them." Well, those drums started to corrode. In 1979, large quantities of contaminants had been carried into the creeks by snow melts. I reached the water table. The EPA had discovered high levels of metals, heavy metals, benzene, toluene, and PCBs among 140 other substances. Cleanup was conducted in 1983 and completed in 1990. However, 2003 survey indicated that PCB was still in the sediment surrounding the area, high levels of it, and further testing was ordered. Now the EPA is stating for every 5 years we're going to do a review of this area to make sure, is it being cleaned up? And as I stated, it was being carried into the water and into the water table as it sinks down into the soil, contaminating the areas around. So a lot of contaminants, a lot of problems in that region. 1984, one of the big ones. Some of you may be old enough to be aware of this. And this was the Bhopal disaster. One of the biggest ones to affect somebody. Union Carbide in India had set up a plant, and it released 45 tons of methyl isocyanates, MICs, other gases. So you had the big one was hydrogen cyanide come from this plant and leaked into the whole area around Bhopal, India. The final death toll was 15,000 to 20,000, but it also affected people, 500,000 people with respiratory problems, eye irritation, and blindness. Investigation had revealed that protective equipment was not provided to not only the people around the area, but also the people working on the particular chemicals. 400 tons of industrial waste were discovered on site in 2001. Union Carbide was accused of criminal negligence. They also were identified to have corporate prejudice, and as I said there, and it led to the formation of the Emergency Planning and Competing Rights to Know Act in 1986. So companies operating overseas in any area have to make the community aware of what the hazards are from this particular plant. And a lot of it just came down to people trying to avoid U.S. health standards by going into an area that was a depressed area that had basically no standards at all and cheap labor, and allowing these people to work without any kind of personal protective equipment. Prince William Sound was where we had the Exxon Valdez struck a reef in releasing 18.8 million gallons of crude oil into the Gulf of Alaska. This was the highest release of oil into any waterway at the time. What had happened, the Captain Hazelwood, the captain of the ship, had released his command over to a third mate during the time to steer the ship into the proper area. The third mate, however, failed to maneuver within the shipping channels and steered outside the shipping lanes and collided with the reef. The blame was, although was said to be a broken radar, it wasn't working properly. They were not able to steer properly around the land. And the third mate was also judged to have been sleep deprived, was not professionally qualified to take command of the ship. And Captain Hazelwood was in his bunk asleep at the time of the collision. The oil spill contaminated 1,300 miles of the coastline, a loss of 250,000 seabirds, 2,800 sea otters, up to 300 harbor seals, 250 bald eagles, and 22 killer whales. That's a lot of impact on the environment. They have no idea how many herring or salmon were lost, and fisheries for the crabs, herring, salmon, and shrimp were banned until throughout 1990. Accordingly, Prince William Sound area lost about $580 million in recreational fishing revenue, not even including the commercial fishing. The total impact cost 26,000 jobs in tourism and over $2.4 billion to businesses. Mossville, Louisiana. In this one, a photochemical company was releasing 3 times the safe level of the chemical they were producing in PVCs into the general population area. Contamination resulted in higher levels of cancer, reproductive damage, immune systems impairment, and hormone function disruption and diabetes to residents in the surrounding area. In 2010, the Nadesco Macondo, project of Gulf of Mexico, coastal Louisiana, was the explosion of the deepwater drilling rig there, Deepwater Horizon, killed 11 workers, injured 17, and a couple of days later, the rig capsized, and it wound up being now the largest oil spill in history. At the time, 4 million barrels were released initially. That's 168 million gallons. That was not initially, but that many gallons over 87 days. The explosion was caused by a surge in natural gas blasting through a concrete core. So they tried to seal the pipe. It blasted through that. The gas came up the rig rising platform, and due to the fact that as it rose, it also bit the riser, causing everything to ignite. A blowout preventer to release this pressure malfunctioned due to the bending. It bent under pressure, so it was not a very good blowout preventer. The containment drones that they had tried to install over the leak continued to be blown off by gas hydrates building up. Many of the attempts to stop the flow were unsuccessful. Some of the things that we were supposed to have available with FEMA to contain it also were discovered to have not been actually put inside the FEMA response. It took the pumping of concrete into the channel after 5 months of oil spill to actually seal this thing. The courts determined that 3.19 million gallons of oil had leaked into the Gulf. The oil slick covered 57,500 square miles, including 1,100 miles of the shoreline in Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida. Thousands of birds, mammals, sea turtles were covered in the leaf oil, and by the end of 2015, 1,400 whales and dolphins had been found stranded in the Gulf of Mexico. Estimate turtle deaths during the spill was 65,000. In fact, if you go down to areas like Panama City Beach, you will find a lot of the beaches protected as turtle nesting sites due to the fact that they need to get these populations back up. The number of fish killed during this oil spill is unknown. Damage to the reef, to reef areas within 12 miles of the deep horizon explosion. The oil spill left between 8,000 and 12,000 people temporarily unemployed, cost tens of billions of dollars to clean up, and as well as the associated fines and civil suits, some of which are still ongoing a decade after. The next one is another one of those greed, pretty much evil type things. The Tazreen Fashion Fire District in Bangladesh resulted in the death of 112 workers. A short circuit had occurred in the garment factory and started the fire. The investigation discovered that the fire extinguishers were not working, the factories lacked emergency exits, and the most evil, probably of the whole thing, was the managers locked the gates to prevent people from getting out or escaping the fire. 3 managers and security guards, as well as the 2 owners, were arrested and are now facing homicide charges. The impact this had on globally was Walmart was one of the areas that got their clothing from this, and this called for a lot of people to increase observance of safety and health practices for any offshore manufacturers, to make sure that we are not just sending things over there and not caring about the health and safety of the workers. Moving right along, and so we're going to come back to the 1900s and look at, okay, how did we respond to this? What happened? Why are we moving to safety and health now? Well, in 1900, Frederick Taylor, and many of you have done any management at all, also discovered that if we observe health and safety, it will increase productivity. So he wasn't really looking for this, he was just looking at management. And he discovered that with labor, if you lost personal time, you're going to have an obvious inverse relationship between productivity. So a fallout of this was identifying safety as a major factor inside any type of management. So the safety movement at this time started to begin. There was another book released by Upton Sinclair called The Jungle. Many of you may have read this one, talking about the harsh conditions and exploitations of immigrants inside of all these factories. So the safety movement had begun in 1900. The Jungle comes out, and more people become aware of it. So not just the people working in the factories, they're starting to see everything that came into the cities for people that were getting products from these, and it started to have that impact between what are we producing, how well are they observing safety, and how good is the equipment they produce. The products that I'm buying, are the products safe if the industry is not really concerned about safety and their own workers? It did expose the working class poverty, so it pretty much is saying we're going back to the 1800s, what we were doing in the 1800s. There was very little social support for immigrants, harsh living conditions, and a lot of hopelessness among the workers. Most of the readers of this tome said that they were more concerned about the unsanitary practices that were exposed than necessarily the health of workers, because it impacted them directly in the meatpacking industry. Okay. And it looks like I'm a little behind on my little clicker here, so let's just move right on. 1907. In 1907, 3,200 people were killed in mining accidents. This led the Department of Interior to create the Bureau of Mines, and the purpose for the Bureau of Mines was to investigate accidents, examine the health conditions of the workers, and make recommendations for improvement. They really didn't have a lot of push back then, so until things came out later saying, we can fine you and we can put criminal charges against you, until that happened, we were just making recommendations. So 3,200 people, you see a little bit of spike there around 1917, got close to 3,750. But now, as we go down, in 2019, so last year, only 12 individuals were killed in mining accidents. So that was quite of an improvement. Working conditions now for industrial employees have improved significantly over the last century. Worker deaths are down from 38 deaths per day in 1970 to approximately 14 in 2017. The workers' death risk in the industry is about 60% less than it was 50 years ago. We need to do better, but that's still pretty good. And worker injuries and illnesses are down from 10.9 per 100 in 1972 to 2.8 per 100 in 2017. So actual injuries and illnesses are down 70%, while as our risk is at 60%. We still have a little bit of work to do. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this has been going for just about an hour. So let's take a break right here and we'll continue in section B.